My name is Grace Relf. I am with Berkeley Lab, and I'm excited to be here with you all today to talk first about coordination across planning processes. I worked formerly with many of the folks in this room at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, where we got to work on integrated grid planning efforts. And so, I'm excited to talk about this topic, which I think is very tangible and actionable, no matter where you're at in your planning process. So today I'm going to go over the why and the how of coordinated planning. So why you might undertake it, and different actions that you can take to coordinate your plans. And then we're going to get into the different type of planning processes. So for each type of plan, I will go over why it's important to coordinate that with your distribution system plan, some key activities and challenges associated with doing so, and then provide an example of a state or utility that you can draw from in your own work. And then finally, as with most of the other presentations, I will end with some actions that you can take and questions you can ask. So let's get into it. So depending on your state's policy objectives and your planning landscape, utilities and other entities will be required to submit various kinds of plans. Historically, all of these planning processes have been quite siloed, meaning that the processes really do not consider one another, and oftentimes there are different teams staffing those planning proceedings within the utility or even externally as well. So coordinated planning aims to harmonize those traditionally siloed planning processes by aligning inputs, methods, and information flows. The image on the left here shows that states that require some sort of distribution system plan, this might be a grid mod plan, a DER plan, an integrated grid plan, or a transmission and distribution system improvement plan. And then on the right, almost all of those same states, and quite a few more, require integrated resource or similar plans. So where utilities own generation, they will create a plan that looks out into the future to see how much electricity they'll need to provide and what the best way to provide it is. And so while those two different types of plans do address different kind of spheres or levels of the electricity system, they frequently aim to meet similar objectives like making rates affordable, ensuring reliable supply, and reducing emissions or reducing risk. So coordinating these and other planning processes helps to make sure that you're capturing all the relevant factors that influence your distribution system needs. Okay, so the why and the how. So coordinated planning offers a lot of different benefits, and ultimately the aim is that it will result in better quality plans that are more useful to you as regulators, as state energy offices, as policymakers, or as utilities. Using inputs that are aligned across planning processes helps to ensure that the plans are consistent and not in conflict with one another. Coordination also helps to make sure that planners and stakeholders are capturing all the relevant distribution system needs. So, for example, if a resilience plan indicates that backup power or distributed generation would be helpful at a critical facility, the distribution system plan could then capture that and identify whether any upgrades or infrastructure is needed to accommodate that. Similarly, coordination helps to make sure that you're assessing all the possible investment alternatives. So for example, would a program in your energy efficiency portfolio be able to help reduce congestion or avoid unnecessary investments that at a lower cost? Planning coordination also helps to increase understanding, transparency, and the credibility of your results. Stakeholders that are familiar with inputs and different aspects of different plans are going to have an overall better understanding of the planning context and landscape, and they may even have previously vetted different inputs into your plan, and so they'll have better understanding and better trust of the distribution system plan and its outputs when it comes to that. Along those lines, stakeholders will also be able to bring more diverse perspectives, and this really helps to improve the quality and depth of information that will inform your distribution system plan. And then finally, folks working on multiple interrelated plans may find that they are able to apply their knowledge across different proceedings and speed up their review and work. I definitely found this at my time at the Hawaii Commission, where having a holistic view of the integrated grid plan helped a lot of my other work. There are many ways to align your planning processes. So no matter where a utility or regulator is in terms of your sophistication of your planning efforts, there are ways to begin or to improve coordinating your plans. The approach that's best for each jurisdiction is definitely going to vary based on your staffing and resource availability, the modeling tools that you have available, or other supportive resources like technical assistance, your planning objectives, and how much experience stakeholders have with planning as well. And I'm going to break down the coordination activities on this spectrum here, which can be used in conjunction with one another and applied to different aspects of the planning processes. So as a first step, this does not even require any specific direction or mandate from the regulator or otherwise. Utility regulatory staff or other participants can independently draw on information from other plans to help inform your distribution system plan. So for an example, an intervener like a state energy office or consumer advocate might ask whether the utility has considered the impacts of a DER plan in the distribution system planning inputs. This is a pretty simple activity that you can take via your discovery or information request process. Some states and PUCs require the utility to give a narrative description of how it considered other plans in their distribution system plan. So, for example, the PUC might ask the utility to describe how the distribution system plan supports the objectives in a statewide clean energy plan. Additionally, commissions can require utilities to start streamlining stakeholder engagement efforts. So, for example, the commission or other stakeholders might ask whether the utility is running other meetings for a different process and ask whether they could bring any distribution system planning information to that meeting to help bring more stakeholders into the mix of distribution system planning and help to start raise awareness of that. So moving along the spectrum, many PUCs require that utilities use the same set of inputs across different plans. So for example, utilities can use consistent load forecasts across their distribution system and integrated resource plans, or they can use the same assumptions about electric vehicle growth or DER growth. It's not always possible to exactly align the inputs that you're using. There might be different timelines that you're working on or different kind of granularities, but it's important to at least align your methodologies and make sure that your inputs and assumptions are not in conflict with one another. Similarly, you can use the same scenarios across plans. So you could also create scenarios that account for other planning processes. So for example, you might direct the utility to use a high DER future scenario in both the distribution system plan and in your IRP. Finally, an emerging best practice is to start creating more fully integrated planning processes that have feedback loops between the different levels of the electrical system, which helps to make sure that the distribution system plan's results really account for what's happening at other levels of the system. So why isn't everybody just doing this already? So it is challenging to make this happen. When planning efforts are siloed, it can draw attention away from sort of nitty-gritty details on specific aspects of your planning process. So I think my colleague from Hawaii mentioned earlier that in the integrated grid planning process in Hawaii, some of the focus on that really granular distribution system planning was lost. And so that can be a challenge with coordinated planning. Additionally, because you're addressing a very wide breadth of topics, stakeholders might find it more challenging to engage in the process, especially if they have like a more niche interest. Maybe somebody is intervening really with a specific focus on electric vehicles, and they're really not interested in the transmission system as much or don't know as much about it. There are ways to overcome these challenges and help create a really nice pace of planning that's sustainable for everyone. So folks who are setting up that planning process at the utility, at the regulator, or just weighing in on the schedule can help to make sure that there are very clear milestones and that the calendar of events and meetings and work streams is thoughtful and takes into account other planning processes. Also, everyone likes to be heard, and although it does take a lot of time and effort to effectively engage with stakeholders, an important piece of this puzzle is to make sure that those stakeholders that are helping you with your planning process are able to participate effectively and that they know that their inputs have value. And so responding and communicating with stakeholders is an important piece of this as well. So utilities and other stakeholders play very important roles in coordinating plans. Utilities are typically the ones leading the distribution system planning process, and so they functionally carry out many aspects of coordination and then demonstrate to everyone else how they did so. PUCs can be supportive of those efforts by establishing expectations and requirements, hosting technical conferences, and providing input and feedback to utility plans. Other state agencies can also facilitate coordination with the plans that they develop or oversee. So for example, coordination with transportation departments can be important for EV planning, or health departments might have input on air quality or climate planning. And then of course, state energy offices conduct energy security planning, which is highly interrelated with utility infrastructure and planning. So stakeholders that participate in PUC and planning proceedings can also help by providing their technical expertise and insights and draw on information from the plans that they interact with. This chart demonstrates that the coordinated planning landscape is going to look different depending on your state and your jurisdiction. So depending on the market structure for your utilities, different entities like regional transmission organizations or federal power marketing authorities or even community choice aggregators have important roles in planning for different aspects of the energy system. And this chart notes that even where organizations are not the lead planners, which are the dots, they still need to consider the other plans that are shown in this chart, and that's the shaded areas. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the different types of plans and dig a little bit more deeply into the ways that each of those intersect with the distribution system. Okay, I thought it might be interesting to see how the planning landscapes are different from folks in this room. So I'm going to run through this list and raise your hand if your state does this kind of planning. So integrated resource planning, most folks. Transmission planning, okay. Grid modernization, a few. Electrification, which might be like EVs or building electrification, nice. DERs, fewer. Resilience planning, specific resilience plans, a few. Decarbonization planning or climate planning, okay. State energy security planning, okay. Any integrated planning here, I know a few at least, nice. And then distribution system planning, great. Are there any other plans folks want to call out that I didn't list in here? Yeah, transportation electrification planning. Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting to think about what plans might be happening in your state and how they might intersect, and we'll get a little bit more into that. Did I see one other hand? Yeah, wildfire mitigation planning, that's a huge one for sure. Okay, so all of those are types of plans that we're going to talk about, and in general, some of them do have more direct intersection with the distribution system than others. When done separately from distribution system planning, grid modernization, DER, and electrification plans are particularly important for in-depth coordination. You might actually consider even incorporating them into your distribution system plan rather than have them as standalone plans. The top right image here shows states that conduct those distribution system planning processes. Other electric system planning processes like IRP, transmission, and plans that look at resilience for specific threats like wildfire are also very impactful to the distribution system. And you can consider starting to take steps to coordinate or deepening your coordination with those plans. And the image on the bottom right here is states that do some sort of resilience planning. So it's expanding in that area. Other state plans can also impact distribution system planning, and it can be helpful to make sure that those are considered as well. So for example, state energy security plans may have important findings for siting infrastructure to reduce vulnerabilities and for maintaining a safe and resilient system. State housing plans and transportation plans can affect how much demand is on your system and where that demand will be occurring. So yeah, just take a think about what plans might be intersecting with your distribution system. So bulk system planning, integrated resource and transmission planning is important to coordinate because there are many interactive effects, of course, between the distribution system and the transmission and generation systems. For example, one interactive effect is between DERs and the bulk system. DERs can reduce the need for generation, or can even serve as non-wires alternatives to help reduce grid constraints, often in a more timely manner than it takes to develop a new transmission line or build a new power plant. Utilities can start to coordinate these processes by using the same inputs and assumptions and running some of the same scenarios between the IRP and DSP. When you're using the same data sets across these types of plans, it can require translating those data sets for use at different levels. So circuit level data is likely not necessary for your IRP or transmission plan, but it is definitely necessary for DSP. Some challenges for coordination with bulk system planning are that there are many different entities involved, which adds some complexity and resources required to make sure you're effectively engaging the different parties that are involved. And then reconciling those different perspectives and information across entities. Maybe the plans look at different planning horizons or have different granularities between the data sets. As an example, California has many different entities that are involved in bulk power planning, and they've actually had a memorandum of understanding in place amongst the key entities for over a decade that aims to ensure that the different entities are using the same assumptions and that they are working together to figure out how best to translate each other's data for use in the different planning processes. So I think it was mentioned earlier that the California Energy Commission leads an integrated energy policy report that really is the foundation for key assumptions and inputs used across the different planning processes. And then the CPUC also provides more specific guidance on how all of this information gets used and translated for the distribution system plan. So for example, utilities doing distribution system planning have to ensure that the system level data are aligned with the more granular locational data on their systems. And that can be a very technical but important exercise. As a utility example, Duke, Indiana conducts integrated resource planning, but has explicit sections of that IRP that discuss how it coordinates with transmission and distribution system planning. Some of the actions that they're taking are making sure that their functional teams at the utility are all involved in the IRP process. They also rely on data from the Regional Reliability Organization, and they work closely with the independent system operator to give input on the ISO's transmission planning process and to make sure that the IRP reflects what's going on at the ISO level as well. So grid modernization is, of course, very relevant to the distribution system because it lays out the strategy and implementation roadmap for capital investments and other expenditures. There's a lot of overlap between grid mod and distribution system planning because they really inform one another, and when you coordinate these plans, it can reduce duplication of efforts, and it increases the transparency and holistic consideration of the investments that you must make to meet your distribution system planning objectives. Ideally, a grid mod plan would actually be part of an integrated distribution system plan. As an example of coordination between grid mod and distribution system planning, I wanted to highlight Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, utilities file what they call electric sector modernization plans that function as that distribution system planning document. State law in Massachusetts required that an advisory council give input into these plans. And that activity in itself actually helps to increase coordination because there's a lot of representation from different industries on that advisory council. So they have representatives from the healthcare sector, from academia, from local governments, and those folks are bringing different perspectives to this electric sector modernization plan, which is very helpful. I like this graphic from National Grid's ESMP, which you can look at in more detail. It's linked on the slide. But I just kind of like that visual that there are different levels of the system that you need to look at and coordinate. And it kind of brings your mind to the sense that we are looking at all of these holistically. We've also heard a lot today about how electrification and DERs are both significant drivers of the need for investment and modernization in the distribution system. This creates new planning opportunities, but also challenges for utilities that need to understand where and when those new loads are going to appear and to be able to physically accommodate those resources and meet the load. To coordinate these planning processes, utilities would ideally combine them into the integrated distribution system plan. But you can also use some of those really good foundational distribution system planning practices, like explicitly considering any policy goals or targets related to DERs or EVs or electrification, using good data and forecasting processes, and then deploying DERs as non-wires alternatives as well. DER and electrification planning and coordination activities can be inherently uncertain, which creates a planning challenge. Additionally, it can be challenging for utilities to get good data on these resources because they might not yet have the infrastructure in place to collect those data sets. So identifying how to get those data for future planning cycles can be a really helpful activity to improve consideration of DERs and electrification in your distribution system plans over time. As one example, Minnesota actually required utilities to combine their integrated distribution system plans with their transportation electrification planning processes. And these images on this slide show just some of the ways that Excel Minnesota has been considering transportation electrification within its DSP. On the bottom there, it works to align the use of its modeling tools and forecasts across the different planning processes where possible. And then they also use granular forecasts for locational EV charging needs and other beneficial electrification impacts, such as for water and space heating efforts. Nevada's utilities produce what they call distributed resource plans as part of their IRP. NV Energy's distributed resource plan has full sections that discuss how it is integrated into the IRP and how their DER and transportation electrification planning impacts system needs. The Nevada PUC also requires utilities to create public DER portals, which include very granular locational DER data, as shown in these images, and that we've talked a little bit about already today. The provision of this data is really helpful for transparency and for helping other entities understand the system. So we talked a little bit about how developers can use these maps to their benefit. Moving on to resilience planning. So this is a practice that is growing and is driving a significant need for spending to harden the electric system and improve situational awareness and other aspects of creating a distribution system plan that's resilient to a wide range of threats. Making sure that these resilience-specific investments are considered in conjunction with distribution system expenditures can help to enhance the effectiveness of both of those efforts. Information sharing is really critical for coordination between resilience and distribution system planning. Just ensuring that folks are working with some of the same assumptions around climate impacts, flood zones, and other threats can be very helpful. Incorporating resilience values, metrics, and decision-making frameworks into your distribution system plan and making sure that those things are consistently applied also helps to align proposed investments that will serve multiple objectives. States can also consider whether resilience planning could be part of IDSP, as Lisa mentioned earlier. And I will note, though, that coordination here can be more challenging than with other planning processes because resilience planning is more nascent. One method is shown in the image at the bottom of this slide that's called the bow tie method. It aims to evaluate specific threats and then take steps to identify solutions to mitigate those impacts and create positive outcomes. Even this method, though, is still pretty nascent and can be challenging to implement in reality. In California, utilities do their resilience and microgrid planning separately from distribution system planning, but are required to undertake specific coordination efforts amongst the two. The CPUC has particularly emphasized the importance of coordination with local entities because they play such a major role in their own local resilience planning process. Utilities need to provide those local and tribal governments with the information that they need about the electric system to do informed planning, and they need to coordinate engagement and outreach activities. One thing that I think is pretty interesting about the coordination of these efforts in California too is that the utilities actually need to dedicate staff to this effort and provide a specific point of contact for the local and tribal governments to reach out to and ask questions of. So it's a pretty simple action that you can take, but can be really effective just for opening up that line of communication and starting to establish relationships. In Hawaii, our largest utility conducts integrated grid planning, and as part of that, they did a resilience assessment. They actually tried to deploy that bow tie method and started to identify how they would coordinate their hardening and awareness investments across the system going forward. However, the assessment was pretty light on detail. You can kind of see that in the graph this on the bottom here, which does not actually include any numbers on the y-axis. So it's kind of a theoretical framework for investing in resilience. But the commission did ask that they improve this process over time. And I will highlight that one aspect of the resilience planning effort in Hawaii that was very effective was that the utility hosted a resilience working group. They included folks from the State Energy Office, emergency management, and other agencies too, to help them prioritize the threats and inform their decision-making. And that document has served as a pretty foundational document across the state for resilience planning since then. State energy plans are holistic looks at the state's energy system. So it goes beyond the utility or the electric system and looks at the energy ecosystem as a whole. They're often legislatively mandated and help to provide a unified vision and consensus on what the state's energy goals are. Much of the content of a state energy plan will impact your distribution system. So to effectively coordinate these plans, it's important to consider the relevant utility data and plans that, and to have those utilities or stakeholders help to interpret the information that they can provide to the state energy plan. Often those state energy plans are much higher level, less granular than your utility plans. And so having someone who can be a technical kind of advisor or support on that can be very helpful. North Dakota has a state energy plan that is really focused on how the state's really abundant energy resources can support its economic development. The plan identifies a number of activities that could impact the distribution system plan, or the distribution system overall, like adding new infrastructure and new large loads, creating energy parks, which also could add more load, and deploying energy storage systems. Closely related to both resilience and state energy planning is state energy security planning, which include an assessment of the energy landscape and of potential threats and risks to the energy system. And it usually also includes a risk mitigation approach. These plans are really important to ensure that stakeholders are operating under a common understanding of the landscape, and then they can help to surface information for use in the distribution system plan, like mapping critical facilities or critical infrastructure or developing certain forecasts that can be used across plans. In order to do that, states can use working groups and other information sharing tools. You can cooperate with other states or tribal entities. And this touch point, again, with those localities or other jurisdictions is really important because of their critical role in emergency planning and response. This can pose a challenge, though, of course, because those entities bring different perspectives to the table, and it takes resources to engage with multiple planning entities at once. There's also a chance that you might need to share sensitive data throughout this process. And so setting up that communication tool and protocols can also add a layer of complexity to your coordination. I got to participate in the initial stages of some of these efforts in Hawaii, where our state energy office is leading the charge to prepare the energy security plan. And they spent a lot of time working across key stakeholders at different agencies and organizations to solicit input on the work that they were doing for emergency preparedness and risk mitigation, identifying interdependencies between infrastructure and organizations, and creating a common operating picture for our energy sector across the state. The image on the bottom of this slide's pretty hard to see, but it does show an interactive map of Oahu that delineates the different interrelationships in the energy sector on our island. So you can actually click on one of the refineries and see where that fuel goes and how it's used, and really kind of get a visual sense of the energy landscape on Oahu. It's pretty cool. Finally, I wanted to talk about how distribution system planning can be coordinated with rate cases and cost recovery practices. It's really important that these two practices are coordinated because plans are an important tool for providing the context and justification for proposed expenditures. Ideally, a distribution system plan would help to show how investments align with the overarching visions, objectives, and principles for the distribution system. And of course, nothing in the distribution system plan would be presumed to be pre-approved or to have granted cost recovery automatically. Utilities can use the distribution system plan to help regulators and other stakeholders in their review of those expenditures in rate cases or other cost recovery proceedings. So to start coordinating these efforts, it's really helpful when regulators can outline their vision for how the two processes interact and the sequence of different filings and how they will inform one another. A few things to keep in mind on this is that we know things will change over time. Plans are not often a snapshot in time or intended to be flexible documents. They can become outdated or need to be adjusted. And so in part because of that and for other reasons, commissions don't typically approve a distribution system plan, and utilities would still need to provide very robust justification for their proposed investments when it comes to that time. Distribution system planning and rate cases are very clearly linked in California. The CPUC has provided and refined its vision over time for how those two processes interact. They outlined common vocabulary that they would use in both proceedings. They sought to align timelines and content requirements for the filings. And then they established a vision for how they would evaluate investments and even outlined some specific expectations on certain elements of the distribution system plan, like rate making and metrics that they would want to see. Last year, the state also passed a law that touches on coordination across these two processes to ensure that the utility is effectively planning to be able to meet the state's electrification and DER goals. So there's also an option to move beyond simple coordination and to actually integrate plans into a comprehensive system or grid plan. These types of plans look at DERs, the distribution, transmission, and generation systems all in one plan, and might even include gas planning for dual fuel utilities. This is, we talked a little earlier about how this really is a pretty new endeavor, and the modeling capabilities and experience that utilities have are definitely still growing. The image on the right here is a diagram of approaches to enhance system planning from an RMI report. And one element that they highlight is to integrate your resource transmission and distribution planning efforts. This diagram shows Hawaiian Electric's integrated grid planning process. So on the left, it starts with inputs, assumptions, constraints, and scenarios that feed both into capacity expansion and distribution system planning analyses. And then at multiple stages of the process, the outputs of these analyses feed into one another. And if certain planning criteria are not met at those points, the utility would adjust its approach or iterate on its inputs and assumptions and kind of go back to the beginning to iterate on those findings and ultimately come out with a plan. To me, this illustrates that even utilities that are pretty advanced in integrated grid planning are still largely conducting the distribution system planning process in a different or siloed process on its own, and then finding ways to incorporate those findings and create feedback loops between those planning elements. But this will become more sophisticated over time, and those modeling capabilities for co-optimizing resources are definitely improving. All right, so I'll just have a few concluding slides, and then hopefully I'll leave you with some ideas for your workshop and state planning activities as well. So this diagram is intended to show that many states are pursuing some type of coordination of their distribution system plan with other plans. Some states are taking a more comprehensive approach, like Oregon, which coordinates and integrates many different planning processes. And they're also taking a variety of approaches to how they're coordinating, like using the same inputs and doing iterative modeling. Other states are still getting started with coordination, like in Rhode Island, where they simply require a description of how the utility considered DER plans in the distribution system planning process. At this point in time, there are some best practices for you to consider as you work on system planning in your state. So first, aligning data sets and scenarios is very important. Next, streamlining and thoughtfully coordinating your stakeholder engagement will help to reduce participant burnout and get meaningful input on your plans. Next, providing a sanity check on timing requirements for different filings and helping to calendar out your proceedings will be very helpful to make sure that there's a logical and feasible flow across your information and proceedings. You can also walk before you run and do more in-depth coordination where you'll get the most value from it, such as for plans that are more mature in your state and where you have more experience. As you do this, I really encourage you to try to eliminate requirements as you go. So if there are reporting requirements across different proceedings that could be streamlined, this is going to help everyone with administrative efficiency and consolidation and reduce the number of pages you have to look at across proceedings. And then finally, consider how your coordination has gone and where could you get more value next time or what could be improved. Again, I've really enjoyed thinking about this topic because I think that the actions that you can take are very tangible and accessible. So regulators, state energy offices, and consumer advocates, you can all help to identify plans that should be coordinated and data sets that the utility can use either in guidance or in working groups or in technical conferences. It can be really helpful just to illuminate the existence of certain data sets or plans and to ask for more information on how the utility has considered those. State energy offices, you can also play a very unique role by starting to invite your utilities and other stakeholders into your planning meetings and workshops and create those communication channels with your state energy planning. For coordination, I actually divided these into like pre-filing and post-filing questions because once the train has left the track for your distribution system planning process, it's going to be a little bit harder to start coordinating. So at the outset, it can help to surface some specifics about what plans the utility should be looking at, who's leading those plans, and what approaches the utility will take to coordinate those. After the distribution system plan is filed, you can ask the utility and stakeholders for data and information on how things went. What were the tangible outcomes? How did you achieve those? Were certain aspects of coordination effective and others were less so? And then what's coming down the line that we need to prepare for now? How can we be ready to integrate new elements into the distribution system plan next time? So that's what I have for you today. Thanks for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. Thanks.